Well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology podcast version. We had some technical difficulties, which is why we do not have any video at the moment. So you're just going to have to listen to the lecture and look at the notes as we go through them. Okay, so for this, we're going to be talking about ethnicity and nationalism. So that's first start out talking about what is ethnicity. And the term ethnicity is oftentimes a complicated one because in our language and in the use of the term ethnicity, it is oftentimes interposed with the term race. Okay, so someone will be saying like, "Oh, this person is ethnically this," or "their ethnicity is this," when they're actually talking about racial differences. Um, and vice versa. Someone will be talking about their culture, about their community, but they are speaking about race um, and use race as a term instead of using cultural um, dialogue. So this term gets interused and oftentimes confused. But there is a big distinction between the two. Anthropologists see it like this: uh, people are part of a culture, a series of shared beliefs, customs, and histories. These people share a common location, language, and other cultural similarities. What does that sound like? That sounds like culture, right? That's what ethnicity is, right? Ethnicity is about culture. It's a strong connection to the people who share these similar traits, right? It's about who you would turn to in need of support. And to have an ethnicity, you do not have to have racial uh, distinctions, right? So you can be a part of an ethnicity and have different racial backgrounds, right? Because what we're really talking about is culture, right? So we're talking about culture. So ethnicity is about creating culture, right? It's a product of culture. It's a product of the historical and legacy of your ancestors and how they came from one place or another to live in this area to develop these cultural behaviors, the norms, the values, symbols that define what a culture is, right? So it starts out with how people see themselves and how they see others as different. This is important to remember because it's all about when we're going out and doing ethnographic work, right? There's that ethnicity ethnographic. When we're out there doing ethnographic work, one of the things that we really try and focus on is how do people see themselves, right? What is their identity? How do they um, perceive the world, and how do they see other people? Um, because those are the necessary distinctions between one culture and another. And we can see that there are lots. If we go into an area where there's a lot of smaller rural communities, going back to the film that we watched, Dead Birds, the Dani people of Papua New Guinea, for them, their culture is each community is very unique. They might have similar traits from their neighbors, but there is enough distinction between this community and that community to say that they might be a distinct culture, a distinct ethnicity, right? Because there is enough difference between them. Their cultural beliefs, their religious beliefs, right? They might have different gods. They might have different ideas about the afterlife. They might have a different language. Papua New Guinea has a tremendous number of languages that exist within these smaller rural communities. So it starts out with how people see themselves, and the things that are important to them, and then how they distinguish themselves from others. So I like to do this as kind of an interesting exercise. If we think about ethnicity as a part of cultural identity, right? Could we make the case that Colorado itself has its own ethnicity, right? That there is enough distinction between Colorado and other states that make us unique and distinct from other states or other parts of North America. So, what I want you to do is, I want you to think about this for a couple of minutes and consider whether or not there is enough distinction to make us uh, to make us different, right? To single us out as Coloradans and say we are unique, right? And we are special from the folks that live in Texas or Florida or California or New Jersey. Okay, so take a moment and think about it. We'll pause. Okay, so hopefully you took a moment to sort of consider, are we distinct enough to consider ourselves independent? So this is where it gets kind of complicated. So one of the things that we have to consider as we're looking at sort of the distinctness of Coloradans is, are we that distinct in our own identity? So, as a part of this community, we really also accept the fact that we are Americans, right? There's this overall reaching country, right? The United States of America. And we connect ourselves to all the other states. And we say that, this state over here and this state, we're all part of this one grand union. And that we identify ourselves as Americans, right? We rarely distinguish ourselves as, like, instead of American, I'm calling myself a Coloradan. If I were to leave the country and someone asked me where I was from, would I say immediately that I was from Colorado or from Denver? Or would I be saying, I'm from the United States, I'm from America? Because there is that sort of identity that comes along with it. When we're spoken of in sort of the international forum, right? It's rare that you ever hear anyone distinguish one state from another when you're talking about the United States. There are occasional times when that happens, but oftentimes it is an overarching um, sort of cultural melting pot that everyone sort of gets thrown into. So if we think about it in that sense, really there isn't a whole lot of distinction between us and all these other states. We still have a lot of the same um, practical ideas and ideologies that connect all of us together. So yeah, that's one answer. The other answer is that in some ways we are, right? In some ways we are distinct from other places around the country. So if we were to say compare Colorado to Appalachia, right? We're talking about Kentucky, Alabama, the folks that are living in those rural communities. They have a very distinct language or a dialect. Um, there are different values, different core beliefs. They are still American, but they don't have the same sort of um, ethnic identity that we have in Colorado. There's different things that they find to be important, right? Different things that they find to be valuable to consider. Their relationship to um, nature, their relationship to religion, their relationship to family can have, distinct differences between um, folks that might live in Colorado. So, because of that distinctness and because that there is a lot of variation there, we can start seeing that, yeah, there could be some ethnic differences, the cultural differences. So, is it enough to say that we are truly distinct from them? I think that if you're comparing place to place, yeah, you kind of can start to see that there are enough cultural differences to make some of those big distinctions. But there needs to be a fairly large distinction, right? If we were just to compare ourselves to, say, like Southern California, that's kind of a hard stretch. Um, or to Pennsylvania, to Pittsburgh, or to Philadelphia, right? We can look at those places and see more similarities than differences, despite um, any sort of linguistic complications. But then, okay, then we also have to look at um, Native American and indigenous populations, right? Those are very distinctive cultures, right? And they have a different history, a different legacy that they are living. That when we talk about the broad aspects of the United States and Americans, they do not share that same history. In fact, their history is one of oppression and of genocide, right? So we are now looking at, yes, there is a distinct ethnicity in Colorado when we compare it to the other ethnicities, the distinct ones that are also in Colorado, right? If we were to go down to the Ute Mountain Reservation or to the Southern Ute Reservation, we would see different practices. We would hear a different language. We would learn about a different historical experience compared to what we would have learned in our own um, experience in Denver, Fort Collins, or Boulder, right? So now we do have a distinct ethnicity, right? Because again, these are our neighbors, right? These are folks that they were here before us um, and are now here with us. So understanding that those differences need to be taken into consideration, right? So again, it comes down to sort of perspective, right? Are we that much different in, say, Denver, Fort Collins from New York City or some other places? Probably not enough to really make a case for being different ethnically. But if we were to compare ourselves to some Native American communities and indigenous populations, then yes, absolutely, we could say that there are different ethnicities. So again, it comes down to perspective and to sort of the relationship between us and our neighbors that have been here longer than we have. Okay, now let's continue on. So, borders and boundaries. Now, it's interesting to think about how people came to the United States with ideas of race and of ethnicity, right? So, a lot of folks that came over, and we kind of went over this during our last lecture on race and racism, as many Europeans came over to the United States, they were racially considered white, but not ethnically considered to be the same, right? If you were Irish, you were definitely not English, right? Or German, because you had enough cultural differences. And those differences were enough to make you a part of a distinct population. Over time, those immigrants began to intermingle, and you have sort of the modern white American um, sort of existence that has, oftentimes multiple places that they can claim lineage to, right? Whether it's a combination of Scandinavia or Great Britain or France or Germany, right? All of these different places sort of melded together, and we see this in different populations, right? We have that in sort of the Caucasian experience. We also have that in um, the Hispanic or Latinx communities, where you've got people that ethnically share some identity or distinct identities, but through racial similarities, we'll end up finding relationships and continue to um, sort of meld together, combining those identities into one. And this happens anytime that you have sort of this global movement of people, right? You go to one location, you go to a new country, and that country is going to be different. The people there are going to be different, and you will, over the next generation or two, blend in with that majority of people. Whether or not that's going to be, um, combine issues concerning race, or religious identity or any one of those things, right? We end up sort of blending together. Um, I think an interesting thing to sort of consider is this concept of natives versus immigrants, right? And this has become sort of a big issue in the United States, especially because of uh, sort of this issue that has been playing out along the southern border of the United States and Mexico, um, and the perceived threat of immigration. And this plays out in a lot of different ways, right? By this point in our sort of national history, a lot of folks that live here believe themselves to be native from this area, right? So whether or not your ancestors came from Europe or from Africa or from Asia, right? Now we've been here long enough that Americans claim this land as their own, which is, interesting to hear the responses from Native American communities that usually are, saying, guys, we've been here for a lot longer than you have. We are technically the natives, right? But I digress. um, this issue amongst whether or not we gave access to more immigrants, right? To migratory folks that are coming for work and then returning home, or that are permanently moving to the United States. This has become a big issue, and this is an issue that is felt around the world, right? Those borders and boundaries um, have become a place where, is this culture that's moving in, what kind of an effect is it going to have on the population there? Um, it's interesting to see that there's some of this that plays out in Colorado, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever seen like the native stickers that you might see on the back of a Subaru, right? Which is the state car. um, you'll see this native sticker, right? And it looks like the green license plate tag. It says native, right? I'm native to Colorado. I was born and raised here, and for years I have been hearing sort of the same rhetoric of like, oh, we've got so many people moving to Colorado that it's changing Colorado, and there's not many natives around, and it's interesting to meet other natives because there just aren't that many left, because there's so many people moving to Colorado. Well, yeah, that's absolutely true, right? Colorado is one of those places that a lot of people have become interested in moving to for lots of different reasons. For the our natural presence with the Rocky Mountains, and ideas on health, our ideas on education. If we think about politics, which has been bringing a lot of people in, we've seen this really drastic change in politics in Colorado over the last 40 years. Colorado and Denver itself used to be very, very conservative. And over the last few decades, we've been gradually seeing this change in behavior, this change in sort of the ideology of um, the average Coloradan, and a lot of that has to do with people moving to Colorado for those various reasons and changing the identity of Colorado, right? We used to be a red state. Now we are, for all intents and purposes, as far as I'm concerned, a blue state, right? You've got a Democratic governor and a couple of Democratic senators, and a fair amount of representatives um, that are also Democrat. Now, that is a huge change from what it used to be. So, right, there's still this sort of struggle with identifying as native. And what are you making that statement for, right? What is the intent of stating that I am native? Does that put you above uh, everyone else that has immigrated to the state? It's an interesting statement to make. Um, so, all right, let's continue on. So this is not to say that there is always conflict when it comes to ethnic differences within a community. In fact, most people get along fine. It's just not that they, this. If there is conflict, it um, usually makes the news, right? And that's oftentimes the case. Is that anytime that you hear about ethnic differences or cultural differences, it's usually in a negative way on the news. And that's just sort of how our media works. It has a tendency to focus on the bad things and not necessarily the good things, the things that most people experience on a daily basis. The normal things, the mundane or the happy things, rarely ever get shared, right? So most often we hear about ethnic conflict or racial conflict when there is a lot of conflict going on. Um, but for the most people, the average person rarely ever experiences that. Ethnicity can be connected to a country, but it can oftentimes cross borders and connect people who might have a different nationality but a similar ethnicity. So these folks without borders, right? If we'll take a couple of examples here, let's look at the Kurds. Okay, so the Kurds have been in the news for a while now, for the last couple of decades, really. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the conflict in the Middle East. You have the Kurds, an ethnic group who live in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, right? And they live in this area which is called Kurdistan, but doesn't actually exist, right? Not as an independent country. They have these ethnic connections, and they do sort of have some organization, but they really exist as a borderless state. They do not um, have their own home to claim, right? When this part of the area was being constructed post World War One and World War Two, the Kurds weren't recognized as having their own sort of cultural boundaries. So when those borders were created, the borders for Syria, Iraq, Iran, um, and Turkey, well, they didn't include this space. So you have a stateless nation, right? A group of folks that have this shared history, shared um, language, shared legacy, but not any actual land and border that they can claim as their own. We also have the Sami, which are oftentimes called the Laplanders in northern Scandinavia. They were the native population before Europeans, like the Vikings, came to that area, right? They settled there. The Laplanders had been there for quite some time prior to the southern inhabitants of Scandinavia arrived. And so they've always had this distinct cultural identity, um, but they don't have their own state, their own government. They have their culture is there, but they are part of the Scandinavian nations. Uh, if we look at sort of the same issue, but in a different sense, we can look at some Native American tribes. So the Klamath and the Modoc and Yahuskin um, were originally placed on a reservation in 1864. And at that time, that was a treaty that had been established with the federal government so that they would stop fighting, that these ongoing Indian wars would end. And so by treaty, they were put onto reservations. Now, uh, one of the interesting things that happened is that in this area, and this is in Oregon, Washington, Northern California, if you've ever been to any of those places, one of the things that you might recognize is that there is a lot of resources, right? California itself is one of the most resource rich parts of the world, right? And the Pacific Northwest is considered to be one of the most richest in resources, um, in which it wasn't uncommon that some native tribes would only work 6 months out of the year gathering resources, because in 6 months you could have enough resources for an entire year, right? You wouldn't have to work every day to find food, to find resources. Uh, Resources were plentiful. And this was recognized, right? So you've got the Klamath in particular, who were really, really quite good about handling their resources, being sort of on top of their BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, sort of tax issues and stuff. They were able to pay for everything themselves, um, and they had extra resources. And it was at this time in 1954 that the Indian Termination Act took place. And the Indian Termination Act was this sort of advancement by the federal government to buy the lands of native populations, right? They wanted to terminate the reservations, and they would pay for that land, and oftentimes buy with a fair amount of money to do so. Uh, but the federal government also used it as a means to sort of destroy those cultural groups, right? If you displace them, if you say that, well, this used to be your land and you used to have ownership of it, but now you don't, and we're going to restrict access to it, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that becomes a really big detriment to those communities. However, the Klamath, through some nefarious stuff that goes on, which can happen, sold their lands to the federal government without any sort of democratic process, right? The tribal council at the time said, you know what, we're going to do this, and yeah, we're going to sell all this land because, part of the idea too, and this was a long-standing idea in many communities, is that you can't actually own the land. You live there, right? But you can't actually own it. And this was one of those ideas that kind of filtered through. So each member of the Klamath tribe received $43,000 um, for their land, right? For their portion of their land, and they could use that money however they wanted. And if we go back to the 1950s, $43,000 was quite a bit of money, especially if you consider that the average car cost about 2 grand, 3 grand. A house might cost you $10,000, right? So this was the equivalent of sort of hitting the jackpot. The problem is that you're dealing with a population that, for all intents and purposes, had never been given that kind of money or been exposed to that kind of money. And it's the same sort of effect that people have when they win the lottery, right? A lot of people don't understand how to manage money. They are given a lottery ticket. And, oh, I just won $2 million. And then within a few years, they're back to being broke, right? Because they never learned how to manage that kind of money, and they just go on spending sprees. And this happens fairly often within communities that sort of get those sort of payouts. Recently, when I was working on the Ute Mountain Reservation a few years ago, they won a settlement with the federal government for treaty rights. This was treaty rights concerning water. And this treaty that had originally been brokered between the Klamath and the federal government, which was done, I believe, in like 1903, essentially said that the tribe was supposed to get a certain amount of water. That never happened, right? The water that they were supposed to get got diverted towards farmers, right? These are folks that were moving into the area, wanted to start up ranching, wanted to start farming, and ended up taking most of that water. And so the tribe never received the amount of water that they were supposed to get. And so they sued and won this really big settlement. In the case that each individual within the tribe received I think it was right around 26,000. And you could see the results immediately, right? If you were to drive up and down Toyac, the agency center there, you saw a lot of new cars, right? A lot of people went out, bought a new car. You go to the dump and you would see boxes that came from, new TVs or new furniture, right? Things that in the immediate, right, become beneficial, but in the long term aren't beneficial, right? So a lot of that money disappeared rather rapidly. And so we see this sort of thing happen in a number of occasions throughout the country as these identities were taken away. And part of that, the reservation system idea was that, when you lost your reservation, you lost your claim to being Klamath, right? Even though historically, culturally, you would consider yourself to be Klamath, uh, in this case, you didn't have any legal right to consider yourself Klamath because your territory was gone, right? Even though it's still there, right? And you're probably still living on it, right? It's no longer yours and you no longer have claim to it. So this creates some pretty interesting issues. When your territory no longer exists, how do you identify? Right? How do you see yourself? So this is where sort of that borderless state comes into play, that idea of ethnicity, but right, it doesn't give you a lot of control over the overarching governance of that land if you've sold it off. All right, we're gonna pause there, and we'll come back with the next segment. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a few.